Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. And today we have Pamela Kellert. She and I met while we were getting certified for YouMap. One of my previous podcasts had Kristen Sherry on it. And Kristen is the founder and creator of YouMap. And really what that is, it's a coaching program that's designed and based off Gallup, the Strengths Finder. And it's about personalization and coaching to a person's strengths and values. And that's how we met. But Pamela has this fantastic background of leadership. She actually comes from a technical background, a STEM background, but she was leading distributed teams around the world before the pandemic. She has as much depth in terms of hybrid distributed work as I do. She started back in 2014? Is that right, Pamela? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for welcoming me, Nola. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, my God, hybrid really started way before the pandemic. And just before we went on live, we were talking about all the tools that existed back at that time that really haven't been anything close to what we have available today. But yeah, it started really much earlier. My background is actually business administration. I've worked as a strategist for a long time, but then changed my career into getting into project management, predominantly in the transportation sector. And actually, I did work for a Canadian company, Bombardier, at that time. And what global companies have in common is they have distributed teams, right? So as I was working in Malaysia, I did have a large part of the team based in Canada. We were working in Malaysia. And at that time, if you really compare the time zones of Canada and Malaysia, there was no overlapping work office hours. So it always meant that one of us was working in night calls and all of the work was really remotely when I was sharing documentation remotely, working synchronous times, and also managing different cultures. So it was really a very fascinating time.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because I have that background where it was like we had the majority of our business in the US, but we also had a Philippines aspect to it as well too. And that managing across distance, especially when you're managing different cultures, that's not for the faint of heart, especially when you really don't have the technology. It's a constraint that really demands innovation and creativity because you're working with limited supports, right? So how do you make it work? And that's really where I find the people who have actually been doing this for 5 or 10 years, well before the pandemic, they come to it with a really different mindset of like, how do we make this work? Because we know it can make it work. It's really just a temporary thing. So how do you really, as a leader, get the best out of your people? Like, how do you become a better leader when you are facing those types of challenges?
Yeah. I think when you have such a distributed team, there are a couple of elements that I find really important. One is to give a shared goal, because if everybody knows what they are working towards, and particularly if everyone understands what their unique contribution is towards that goal, then they can feel like a part of the overall puzzle, right? And that's when everybody can contribute with their own contribution. Otherwise, they feel lost. So as a leader, I think it's about establishing that clarity of how everyone plays a role. The second aspect that I found really important is communication, because since we're all distributed, we can't just call in for a town hall, bring everyone into a room and share the communication and news and updates at the same time. So we need to share it in a way that everybody gets the same information with the same messages, and so therefore we need to be more mindful about how we organize and structure and disseminate our communication, right? Whether that's per email or maybe via video or conference call. It simply requires to be more mindful about that communication. And I guess the second aspect with the communication also is about being mindful about the receiving end of the communication, because since we don't always see what state of mind the others are, in this case, for example, in the other country, we just need to be mindful about what's going on over there. Do they maybe have concurrent priorities with other projects? How does our project fit in there? Are we competing for resources? And is maybe everything clear about the project? So it really requires more mindfulness, and I guess also empathy to understand where others at and how do we bring them along.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, that's a great point too, because you don't know what's actually happening on the ground in that country, right? Like it could be something else that's impacting the work. So like weather events, right? Climate change is definitely a thing. We actually, when we established our Philippines location, in part it was because we had way back in 2003, we had a national power. It was actually Canada and US, a power outage that went down the entire eastern seaboard, right? And so that's where they brought in that third resource. But what we found is actually the Philippines actually were subject to tsunamis and flooding
Mhm.
and mudslides. And we often ended up being the backup to them because of weather related challenges. So
Yeah,
that's another thing to be with as well too, is like how what's happening on the ground. It's not even work related. That's going to be impacting how people are feeling, how they're approaching the work, how they show up that day, and definitely being mindful and empathetic. People may have lost family members, and if they're at work at all,
exactly.
that's just shockingly hard. So
Exactly. And we don't see that. And since we don't see that, we can't pick up on the subtle cues because I think that's the advantage where we do see each other.
yeah,
We can pick up if someone maybe a little bit down, are they having a bad day? And then we can adjust our communication and interaction. But when we don't have that information, then we just need to be a bit mindful and maybe pick up on more subtle cues on how our colleagues are doing. And yeah, and taking in that information.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And again, it might be cultural too. They might not even be comfortable sharing the emotional aspect. So, how do you even know if they're not willing to share? And how do you get to a place where everybody feels safe enough, regardless of location and whatever's going on in terms of that culture? That's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Because across cultures, we have different types of communicating, right? Especially if we compare, for example, Western versus Asian culture. In Asia, there's a tendency to see not foolish communication, but more humble communication that steps back a little bit to be as something that's aspiring. Versus in the Western world, we tend to be a little bit more stronger in our communication and forthcoming and more direct. So it doesn't mean that one is better or worse. It simply means that it's very different. So understanding also those cultural differences are really important because otherwise it can create misunderstandings, right? It can create a misunderstanding of thinking, oh, I'm not being heard or I was actually overpowering. But actually, it's actually just the difference in communication style, not necessarily an intention. So, and managing remote teams is also just really translating any differences between the different sides or cultures and helping them to understand each other and create that mutual understanding.
Yeah. So team agreements become really important, right? So standards
Yes.
of communication, when you use email, when you use chat, when you use video, or even like a combination. So something like Loom, for example, you've got a video, but you're sharing screens so that you can
Yeah.
actually even emoji use. It is very problematic sometimes because it really depends on your background, your tech savviness, how old you are, right? You approach
Exactly.
it very differently. And sometimes emojis mean different things to different people, even within the same area, right? So
Yeah.
that's one thing to
Very
remember.
true. And it's so funny that you mentioned your text and WhatsApps and so on, because when I started back at that time, this is really like 2012, 14, we were still using Blackberries.
Yeah, no, exactly. I didn't even get a BlackBerry. So literally we had email and
Yeah.
phone.
Yeah.
And that really was it. And then
Yeah.
gradually we started getting like WebEx and that type of video kind of webinar software. But
Yeah.
it took time. It really did take time. And it's amazing what we take for granted these days. And actually, that becomes its own problem because nowadays we have so many channels. That's where it's like that team agreement becomes important to actually define what's going to work best in certain specific situations, right? Because everybody comes to it differently. Everybody has different technical understandings of how to use those different systems and when.
Yeah.
And so that can become a challenge as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. That agreement is really important because otherwise it's a challenge of where did I communicate what and where do I find the information? Yeah, absolutely. I think another aspect that's also important is to find ways of how to create that team cohesion, right? Because when we start often a project with people distributed by just meeting individual peoples, and as we go through the phases of storming, norming, forming, and performing, we get to develop that cohesion with others. We get to know our team members better. We get to appreciate them as human beings better. And I guess that relates to our earlier point, really, how to create empathy. How do I know what's going on in my colleague's life, and how can I be mindful of that?
Yeah, exactly. But it also leads into things like job crafting. So again, coming back to like UMAP and that personalization, how do you work with an individual and optimize their natural skills, their values so that the work feels more like flow? Is it possible that there's work that they're doing that really is really not ideal for them, but you could rejig it in the team and reassign tasks to people who would enjoy that more. So that's job crafting, that's personalization, and it's optimizing the employee experience for those individual employees because the goal is really to make sure that the team is performing at its peak. If you're really rigid in terms of descriptions and you don't have that type of flexibility, that can be cause its own problem as well too. Do you have experience like that where you've actually structured or restructured job descriptions and like reassign tasks within a team?
Yeah, we did quite a lot. Actually, if I do take that project as well, we ramped up and scaled the team from initially 5 people to over 100 over a couple of months. It
Wow.
was a pretty rapid scale and growth. We actually had to continuously change the roles in the team because as we had new team members coming in, we had to change a little bit the reporting lines, and also adjust depending who else came in, what additional experience we were able to recruit into the team. So yes, I think as good leaders, we need to continuously keep an eye in terms of what small changes lead to better results for the overall team.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I actually find that that's a compelling use for AI as well, too, because you don't know what you don't know about people. So there is software out there that can actually identify the skills and really by like the complementary skills that you don't even realize as a leader people have, right? They may not have told you, but it might be information that the company has because it's on their resume, it's in their background, it's in their certifications. There was one example that I came across and it was just they were looking for people who had a math background, and it caught my attention because I have a math background, right? But they were working as customer service, but with a little bit of an additional training, they were actually able to move them into a data strategist role and increase their salary 3 times just by knowing that those skills existed and
Yeah.
realigning them. And so that's a
Yeah.
fantastic way to retain people is how can you take those skills that are innate to that person and then redeploy them into something that's actually going to be future focused and it's going to benefit
Mhm.
the company more than where they actually enter the company.
Yes, absolutely. That's a fantastic story because we have so many new roles that are being created, particularly in the STEM sector, right? There's so many new roles and abilities that didn't exist in the past. So people not necessarily bring 5 or 10 years experience in those things. But also because the STEM sector is growing so rapidly, we will need to be able to find people who can transfer their skills and knowledge into the STEM sector. And I guess it's funny that you mentioned that because I guess I was one of those, because my background is not a technical background. I studied business administration, but I've always worked in strategy. And in strategy, what we're after, it's about finding solutions, solving complex problems, right? Breaking it down into sub elements, analyzing it, finding solutions, and then implementing a solution. And I think why I was able to make the transition into managing engineering projects, it's because it's the same. It's about managing a complex project, breaking it down into sub elements, analyzing it, finding a solution, and putting it together into an overall plan. So I think it was that capability that I was able to transfer. And you're right. If we dedicate more time with our employees to helping them transfer the skills that they have already, we could actually multiply the capabilities that already sit in our organization.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like sometimes the people who have these capabilities don't even realize how valuable they are. And that's where it's like, how can you supercharge it? And we were talking before about when you're working from home, especially women, they tend to have a smaller network. They don't necessarily get out to events or they show up to networking agreements or events. They don't necessarily present themselves in the same way that a man would. It's really just the reality of gender. So this is a way that people can become more visible in a way that's much more personalized and comfortable. That's a way that as leaders and managers, we can really help women overcome this perceived barrier of remote work. Because personally, I think it is a perception, right? It's really how you use the tools. But I think there's an onus and a responsibility on managers and leaders to really dedicate themselves to looking at these opportunities.
Yeah, I agree. I think, especially if you're in your early career, you don't always know how do my skills play a role. First of all, to understand what are the skills and the innate talents that I have. That's the first challenge. Unfortunately, it's still not something that it's taught at schools. I think all of us should learn that at school already. So that's the first hurdle, right? Understanding what is it that I'm really good at and that can help me to create value. Then the second step is to map that with what is a role or responsibility that really matches that skill fantastically. And I think here it's really that collaboration between individual, but I think you're right, probably the onus on the employer, because the employee requirements are obviously continuously changing as the market changes, as dynamics changes, the roles change as well. So as employees, particularly early in our career, we don't necessarily have that overview. And therefore, we don't always have that overview of understanding where do I fit best. I think it's having that continued conversation about how else could I contribute. It's not just one role. We often can contribute in various roles.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the role of a manager or leader is really morphing and changing and being more of a coach, right? And
Yeah.
it's that ability to identify the raw talent and skills and just mindset really that exists in individuals and then getting them to the right direction. And that's where yes, there's technical aspects and transactional things that you're responsible for, but that leadership and that coaching ability, that's where you're going to retain people. That's where you're really going to set them up for success in the future. And if you're doing that on an individual basis, you're setting the organization up. And that's where I see successful organizations are really dedicating themselves to this type of upskilling. And it's unlearning too. What do you have to unlearn and what do you have to relearn? And what new things can you learn
Yeah.
so that we're all positioned well for not just what's happening right now, but 5 or 10 years from now? And this is where I call my role the hybrid remote futurist because it's not just a solution for right now, it's what's going to happen in the future. So, are you seeing aspects of that when you're working with leaders? Because you're helping them become better leaders. Are you seeing this type of instinct?
Yes, absolutely, Nola, because the environment is changing much quicker, much more rapidly, whether that's from the market perspective and customer requirements changing, which influence the organization, or also competition, right? We see more and more disruptive market entrants, and that changes really everything in the market. So what it means for organizations instead, we need to be able to adapt quicker. And if we want to develop better adaptability on an organizational level, it really means we need to understand our teams much better because it's easy to just adapt and change tools. It's relatively easy to adapt and change sites. But what is much more difficult to adapt and change is our human capital, right? Because when we have large teams, how do you bring everyone across? It's really change management and helping everyone along the change. And that starts with each individual.
Yeah.
So you're right. I fully support that. The role of leaders in the future is really to become a coach for their team members. And what I like saying is the following. I really like that you emphasize we also need to learn to let go or to unlearn things. Because when we grow in our leadership journey, when we step from being an individual contributor to being a leader, we need to learn to stop doing, but rather learn to lead, right? Because we sometimes make the mistake of still continue to do ourselves as a leader, but then we're leader, then we remain individual contributors. So if we're stuck in doing, then our workday is occupied with doing. Then we don't have time to think about how to lead strategically, how to develop the capabilities of our team, or how to, for example, look for collaboration and manage our stakeholders as well. So yes, we have to let go of doing and focusing on leading.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And the other thing I wanted to bring this back to is how is it different for women when it comes to this type of leadership? Because there's a lot of studies that have come out that say basically if you can get women into C-suite, where you look at things differently in terms of that collaborative aspect, right? And we focus more on that research and development aspect, right? What are your thoughts
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, there's a lot of research that has gone into identifying that when teams are more diverse, whether that's women or people from other backgrounds, that companies are much more, they are better in terms of performance, they're more innovative, and it actually reduces risk. And that the background is really that we simply allow ourselves to take in views that are non-homogeneous, right? We suddenly understand views, different perspectives that we wouldn't have considered in the past. And I think particularly as we have these global challenges around the world, and as we see markets evolving very differently, the number one input that we need is different ways of thinking, because we do need different ways of thinking to find solutions for these disruptive problems that we are experiencing. I think organizations really need to tap into this diverse talent pool for the future. That is why we're encouraging more women to grow into leadership roles. But it really is a story with two sides. On one hand, obviously, we want to encourage more women to step into leadership roles, but it's not like they don't want to, right? Women do want to step up into leadership roles. And that leads me to the other side. Unfortunately, we have on organizations and a society overall, we still have challenges that make it difficult for women to succeed in leadership roles. It's because it's really a historical shift that we're currently seeing. If you really look back 100 years ago, thousands of years ago, really our societies have been dominated by men, structured, organized by men. So we're slowly shifting away from our male leadership style and including the perspectives of other backgrounds as well. And that's where we currently are with our society and with organizations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it is systemic, right? So an organization does not just exist with those people and within the system that it creates, right? It's part of society. It's a whole systemic thing that's really feeding into it. And it really comes back to the mental load that caregivers really take to work because it's not like you're just going to work and becoming a leader. You also have to make arrangements for everything that you have responsibility at home. And
Yeah, absolutely.
and it's not only
And
women,
that,
but caregivers.
exactly. So that's one of the things that we see where companies can't change that only on their own and individuals can't change it on their own. It's really a network of several systems and society still plays a role there. Right now, it is a fact that most of the care work is still done by women. And one aspect that's really interesting is if you compare how that evolves between men and women as they progress in their career, as men progress in their career, their share of performing care work reduces. So as men grow up in the ladder, they do less and less care work. Whereas for women, even though they step up into senior roles, it remains nearly the same.
Yeah.
Which means as women step up into more complex leadership roles, and obviously they experience challenges there, they still carry the same workload at home
Yeah.
and care work. So that creates double workload, which obviously does create workload mentally, but also just physically as well. And that is why we do see that women are having a harder time to succeed in senior roles because of the double work. But the other aspect is also that we are not used yet to seeing female leaders succeed, particularly in technical roles, in STEM roles, where women are still the minority. Because of them being the minority, many women still experience certain dynamics that don't favor us. A lot of women in STEM sectors report that they feel unseen and not heard because the attention is not towards them. They're in the minority. So they really struggle to be seen. And with that, also, there's a strong perception that, and experience, not just a perception, but a strong experience that they are constantly being challenged on their competences. Then, if you're having a hard time at work to prove yourself, and at home you're also still doing quite a lot of external work, you're really carrying a lot of burden. And at some stage, you might ask yourself, is this still worth it?
Yeah. And we're seeing that not necessarily just in tech, but in politics. So Ardern and Nicola Sturgeon, both from New Zealand and Scotland, respectively, stepped back from major leadership roles. Jacinda was prime minister, right? And she stepped back
Yeah.
in part because of she was just burned out because of the pandemic. But it's also the hostility and the constant questioning and even just the narratives between when a female leader like that steps back and recently in Toronto, the mayor actually stepped back and resigned because he was caught in a cheating scandal. Just the narratives between why he stepped back and how many people stepped up to support him and how many people attacked them for stepping down. It's just along gender, we have a long way to go to really improve those types of narratives to make it reasonable for and understandable why people actually step back from leadership when there's just too much on their plate.
No, yes, absolutely. And it's really interesting how the world reacts to that, really. So
Yeah.
it really shows that there's some perception about women's role still deeply ingrained. But that will only change over time. And I know many organizations are working on that. I know also there are lots of allies supporting leaders, whether in organization or politics, that are working on helping to transition into a world that's more inclusive. But that takes time. And what I also want to highlight to women who want to step into a leadership role is we can't let ourselves from that and giving up. We do need to take a role in leadership as well, because we want to co-create the organizations and the society of the future. So we need to take an active role. So the question is, how do we surround ourselves with the support that allows us to work in an environment which is maybe not necessarily always supportive, but in a way that we can change it to be more inclusive? And there are ways how to do it. But I think what I always like to emphasize is changing the perspective towards how can I help change this environment? How can I help to make it better?
Yeah. And the magic question that often comes up, and it comes from Zoe Chance. I've talked about her before on other podcasts. She's a professor at Harvard. She asks this question, what would it take? It's the epitome of influences. We know we can do it. It's just what is it going to take to be able to do that? And it frees up the imagination because it's a really open-ended question, right? It's not yes or no. It's what would it take to be able to do that? And she's interesting because she actually had her students take a paperclip and they traded up. And so what can you trade a paperclip up into? And it's all this negotiation strategy. And a lot of this is negotiation, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Yes. What's it gonna take for leadership roles in the future for anybody, for the representation leadership roles to be more equitable, right? I find it's really a system. It's a couple of things. There's not one answer to that. It requires for society to change, which means we individuals as well are part of society. So we also need to see what we need to change ourselves, our direct environment, and then how can we influence the overall society. And it does require also organizations to change.
Yeah.
And I think organizations are picking up on that. So if I take one example, one aspect of how organizations can help for more women to participate in leadership roles is to offer more flexible work environments and to offer, in particular, in leadership roles, alternative role models, alternative role structures. So what I start seeing more and more is, for example, shared leadership roles, where, for example, two people would share a leadership role.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fantastic idea. Why should it definitely not work? CEOs are able to manage several portfolios, right? Of course, me as an individual leader, I can also just manage one or two divisions as well. So that's awesome. I think it just requires the willingness to start working with those models.
Yeah. And right.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
But that's okay. I was just going to say, have you heard of Roll Share? It's actually a company. I think it's based in the UK, but that's not actually what they do. I think Linda Grattan, she's part of London Business School. She's one of the founders or one of the
Right.
main investors in that. But that's what Roll Share does. And I know Marks and Spencer's, for example, it's not even just executives that can view this. Marks and Spencer's has actually invested in role sharing with frontline staff to give them that flexibility because their work is done in person. So how do you
Yeah.
give frontline staff who can't necessarily work from home in that particular role, how do you give them more flexibility? And role sharing is one answer. So it gives them, they can't necessarily give them location flexibility for the majority of their work, but they can give them time flexibility. And
Right.
maybe if they have to do training and whatnot, that type of training can then be done at home because they're doing
Yeah.
it online.
Yeah.
So that role modeling, it's how do we do things differently going forward? And it can be at all levels.
Yeah. Absolutely. Look, you can also see some companies in the past already had established dual leadership roles where you would have a technical lead and a commercial lead together sharing the lead roles. So if that already worked in the past, then why can't we do it now? So I think we can. The question is really just willingness to start implementing it. And the third aspect, I think, in that system of society needs to change, organizations are changing. The third aspect is also individuals. As individuals, we also need to go through a learning curve. And that requires, for example, we as women, we have been socialized in a certain way, you know, and we have been socialized sometimes also with very subtle signs, whether it's advertising or the way how we've been raised, subtle signs that, for example, suggest we need to be perfect, subtle signs that suggest we shouldn't be loud, and maybe subtle signs that STEM is not for us. I'm laughing at this because unfortunately still we see that in some advertising. Now, what we need to do is closing the loop with what you said earlier is we also need to unlearn some of those things that don't serve us. So we have to unlearn some of those notions that have been, that we have received suddenly and rather become active and ask ourselves, what do I want to have instead? What is instead my vision of myself? How can I be a leader? And what would be a leadership style that's actually authentic to myself? Because particularly for women, since we don't have many female role models, and I like saying accessible female role models, because, for example, Jacinta Ardern, I love her, she's amazing, but she's not accessible to me. I can't call her and ask her, hey, how would you go about the situation? So we do need more accessible female role models with whom we can exchange how you go about the situations, how do you develop your leadership style, so that we allow women to develop a leadership style that's really more congruent with themselves. And that's also going to help them to build up a resilience to last in a long time career.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when mentorship and sponsorship really becomes the thing as well, too. It's, there was something that was floating around on the internet the other day. I can't remember who it was, but it was just basically if a woman is talented enough to get that type of leadership training and support and she's promoted, then why is there no accountability for the people who bring her up to really make sure that she's got everything that she needs to succeed? And that's rarely where sponsorship comes in. Oh, I know. It was Herminia Ibarra from London Business School. And that's where sponsorship is different from mentorship. So mentorship is I'll teach you what I know and I'll help you along and coach you. But sponsorship is I'm going to put you in the position where I'm mentioning your name, I'm putting you forward, I'm advocating for you. And I have that responsibility to you where I'm really going to not just help you, but I'm going to advocate for you and mention your name in the rooms that you don't have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need both because, like I say, it's very different type of support. And ideally, surround yourself with all different types of support, whether it's mentoring, sponsoring, or I would throw in also coaching, because I find that all three have a different aspect. And maybe the difference between mentoring and coaching is in mentoring, you have someone sharing their experience and perspective, whereas the coach would have more frameworks and probably more professional tools that they can apply to help, for example, help you discover your authentic leadership style. So tapping into all three is really important. And here is one aspect that studies have shown that women don't tend to proactively ask for the type of support versus men continuously asking, like, hey, I need a mentor or a sponsor. And we women tend to not to do that. So I think we need to step outside of our comfort zone, ask for that support, accept it, and then really leverage it as well.
I actually advocated so hard for mentorship and sponsorship that I actually got a message sent down through channels through our women's ERG that I had to stop because they weren't ready to do anything at a global level like they had told me they were going to, and I had to back off. You have to be careful with that visibility too. And there was something that I wanted to bring in. We had a chat just before the podcast as well too. Visibility is really important because
Yeah.
you can build up and supercharge your networks if you are being visible. And you can do this in multiple different ways. The way that I did it was using employee resource groups, volunteering, hackathons, innovation challenges. So when I changed jobs in 2019, I walked into a new job. Within 6 weeks, I was connected to 200 people in the new division. And I also was a finalist for an innovation challenge, which meant that I was in front of the senior executive leadership team for that particular division. And that's unheard of for a new employee because honestly, by the end of 6 weeks, most people are really just finishing their onboarding. And I'm like, I'm explaining to my boss who these people are. So
Amazing.
most people don't do that. Right.
Yeah.
And that's where it's like there's an opportunity. You don't have to go guns blazing like I do. So you get messages from the global HR chief people officer, but you can find that sweet spot that's going to be comfortable for you. Right.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And one sentence that I tend to hear quite often is, oh, I don't like to promote myself. I prefer my work to speak for itself. That's a sentence that I've heard so many times. And I have them the following answer. And I say, like, have a think about who are the people who actually get to see your results. Because quite often it's only a direct manager and maybe our team, and that's it. So how can you create an impact when your sphere of influence is that small? Right? So if we actually want to create an impact and have our solution seen and heard, we also need to we also need to work on expanding that network.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of ways how to do that. You've already mentioned a few. It's about talking about your contributions. I think what some people are scared of is to stand on a stage and just say, hey, look at me, how great am I? I think that focus needs to shift not from you, shift it from you to what is it that you're talking about? What's the contribution you're making it about that value? Because that's what people are interested in. People want to know, what are you currently working on? How do you go about it? What are the solutions that you have developed? So people are actually interested in that exchange. So what you can do is reach out to people beyond your team, get to know people, and simply share what's on your plate, what are you actually working on. And you'll be surprised people do want to know and exchange.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, that's a thing that happened in the pandemic. The silos increased because as people were leaving organizations for whatever reason, the connections between divisions really narrowed. So if you are a bridge builder and you're that type of person who can see connections between sales and marketing and technology, and you can introduce people and you're going to help the organization build up those bridges, communication is going to flow through the organization better, but then you are known as a super connector. You're the
Yeah.
glue. And that is where you can actually shift the power dynamic of you're one of many employees to you are one of a few people in the organization who has those types of connections and who is known for that type of work, right? You're shifting
100%.
your power dynamic, which is going to help you influence how people see you and you can bring that with you into whatever role you go into.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you highlight that aspect of becoming a power connector. And with that, you create so much value for the organization. And I think a second value is the following. It's not only about the networking that you do, but also what you create with that network. So If you have a chance now to reach out to other people to test ideas or to collect new ideas, to see how they come together, then you're creating suddenly new value that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise created if you had only been alone on your own. So you can actually really increase your performance and creativity by harnessing the power of network.
Yeah. And it's that diversity of thought. Sure, you might be in accounting, but could you actually bring in what the IT person knows, what the sales and marketing person knows, and then all of a sudden you are the creative, fun CFO with a
Exactly.
super savvy tech side to yourself. So then all of a sudden, like that stands out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Then you stand out if you suddenly understand, oh, what would finance say? What would the sales team say?
Yeah,
Or you develop solutions where everybody goes, yep, that's exactly what we need, and we approve it.
exactly. That's right. You're helping tell a story that they can relate to because people and
Yeah.
change happens when the story that people tell themselves changes. Right. And
Yeah.
nobody else can change that story, but the individuals have to. So if you're talking in a way and you're doing corporate storytelling, if you're telling that story in a way that hits all of those points for those different areas to relate to, you're going to create magic.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so that network aspect is really so important if we want to grow in our leadership journey because as an individual contributor at the beginning of our career, we do work through ourselves. And
Yeah.
then maybe we have a team and we create value through our team. But if we want to grow further as senior leaders, we actually create value through collaboration, through
Yeah.
stakeholders, and to bringing in completely new perspectives. So networking becomes increasingly important. And I know not everybody feels comfortable with that. As a little side story, I did not enjoy networking at all. I used to be the one who loved being on her own in front of a laptop and working for Excel files. But it wasn't until I discovered what angle I could take for networking. And I believe each of us can find an angle that they can enjoy in networking. For me, it's the following angle. I love two things that come out from my strengths. Namely, one is to build relationships. And the other one is I'm just a curious person. I'm a learner. Yeah. I love learning. So once I had understood that by doing networking, I'm actually creating a relationship with individuals I didn't know before, and with individuals from whom I can learn. That suddenly opened up my world to actually embracing networking because nowadays that's what I see when someone says networking. For me, it's an opportunity to get to know someone also on a personal level, have a laugh, exchange life stories, and also to learn from others. So
Yeah.
my advice to people is find a way, an angle that's going to make networking enjoyable for you.
Yeah. And it's about building trust, right? And it's David Burkus who actually has this one. And he's trust is not given, trust is not received, trust is reciprocated. So you have to
Yeah.
know people to be able to reciprocate, right? And another story that I like to share as well too, and I keep name dropping in this particular episode. I don't know why. I don't usually do this, but Dory Clark actually has a story because she's an extreme introvert, even though she's like this massive public speaker. She actually started speaking because she found it made networking easier because people would approach her after the speech, already having a topic in mind and understanding her mindset about it. And so it became this natural conversation that happened afterwards. It wasn't just her trying to break into conversations at the side. They already had a topic to approach her with, and that made her feel a lot more comfortable in networking. So it's again, how can you shift that power dynamic so that it's more of what you want to see in the world? And honestly, this is why I have a podcast,
Yeah, yeah, great.
right? Yeah, how can you actually shift it so that you're networking in a way that it is going to work best for you, right?
Yes. And that ties back to what just got earlier, namely visibility. If you are visible, if people know what you stand for, if people know what experience you have, what thought leadership you have, they will come to you and because they will want to know more about your topic. If you're invisible, It's hard. If you're not visible, then people won't come to you. Then the onus will always be on you to
Yeah.
go out and to create that link.
Yeah. You want to be a magnet.
Yes. And exactly.
And that's why I wanted to have you on because you have that diversity of background because you're based in Germany, but you have this phenomenal background where you're Asia and Malaysia and Australia and Canada and US, right? You have this network that's actually extensive across the world. And I thought that your perspectives would be really interesting. So, was there anything that we didn't cover that you would really like to highlight?
I think that's all. I really just would like to encourage everyone to have a look at leadership positions and how they can make a contribution to bring in their ideas. We've discussed the topics about visibility and being connected. I think those are great areas to start.
Okay, awesome. I wonder. And leadership can happen from anywhere, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be on one of these positions where that's the entire job description.
Yeah.
Maybe that's how you start. Find ways to lead within your individual contributor role, and then that can be your springboard. So that might.
Absolutely, Nola. You know what? One question that I get often asked by people in their early career is they ask, how do I know if I'm ready for a leadership role? How do I step into a leadership role? And I always like saying leadership is not defined by a job description. It's not defined by a title. Leadership starts within us. It really starts with that idea and ambition to want to contribute. It starts with having a vision of how else could I do around the world? How else could I create value? Or also to just see how can I help others? Can I help others to grow, to improve things? So if you have ideas how to do things better, you are already a leader by thinking ahead and looking for how to improve things.
Yeah. And even if people don't follow you, you can role model. And I also found that very effective as well, too. I once had an idea, nobody liked it. And so I just did it anyway, because my idea was to really become an internal resource for the external sales team. And nobody would approve it. So I just did it. And then I started getting these calls going, nobody knows how to do this. And everybody in the field is telling me that I need to talk to you. And honestly, that's my favorite thing is like, I've got this idea. I have no idea what to do with it. What can you do to help me? And I have amazing stories that came out of that. So yeah, just
Wow, I
start
love
doing
that.
it.
What a great,
Don't ask for permission all the time.
yeah, just do it.
Yeah, exactly. Pamela, thank you so much. I really appreciate you making the time. And yeah, we'll make sure all your contact information is in the show notes and people can contact you and talk to you about leadership. So thank you for making the time.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.